Back in early spring, I think around April, I had received an email from two very serious and significant beekeeping industry professionals, movers and shakers I would call, and who in a matter of speaking required my attention. Okay. At first I automatically wondered, uh-oh, what have I done? Where did I screw up? And oh boy, to attract their attention. So thinking I was in trouble. Unfortunately, I wasn't. It was none of the above. They shared with me a story, an adventure that they were heading into, and they wished to share that story with you tonight. And in fact, the content of this story is so full of information and inspiring that we realized one meeting was insufficient to get through all the necessary details to complete the story. Originally, we started with 20 minutes each, and it ended up being, I think, 2 hours each, and we're back to 1 hour each. They will be presenting on how they got involved as a Catalyst Plus volunteer and a step-by-step account of their beekeeping development assignment, and in one speaker to Honduras and the other in Africa, in Ethiopia. So that'll be the part 2. So tonight we're gonna have part 1 of their story, and part 2 will be shared in the February meeting. So I hope that not only you're here tonight, but you're gonna be here in January for a special events then, and in February we will conclude this 2-part series, not on Netflix, but just at the RA. It is our objective that by hearing their stories, you will be inspired to venture beyond your comfort space and motivate others in doing. Please welcome tonight's presenter, Rheal Lafreniere.
Thanks, Tim. You actually captured the struggle that Daryl and I had to put together these presentations. Originally, we said we were just going to tag team and we're just going to show some pretty pictures from the places that we have been on our various assignments. But I came to the realization that I'm a type of person that doesn't walk around with their camera on all the time. So when I actually looked at all the pretty pictures I had, I take pictures of plants. And I don't have a lot of pretty pictures, so I said, that's not going to be that entertaining. And so I continued to talk to Daryl about what kind of things we would do, and I said, I think I want to talk about, how the whole Catalyst Plus advisor role kind of got started for me. I was going to try to put together a journey of, that idea right to actually carrying it out. And as I kind of mowed that thing around, I kind of kept on coming back to this idea of the journey of this Catalyst Plus advisor. And I don't know if everybody here is a fan of The Hobbit, but it kind of reminded me of the Hobbit's tale. So when I was asked for my presentation title, I basically titled it, There and Back Again, a Catalyst Plus Tale by Rheal Lafreniere, which is just a complete take on the Hobbit's tale with Bilbo Baggins' memoir of his adventure, his journey. So there's going to be a few little takes about the Hobbit throughout this thing to kind of keep me in line. But what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to share my experience, but my experience as a journey through this whole process. So my journey doesn't take you to Middle Earth. Although I would love to see the Lonely Mountain, I got to see some different mountains. My journey is going to take you to Central America. So the center of America, Middle America. And in fact, my journey is kind of in the middle of Central America in Honduras. And even then, I'm still in the middle of Honduras in this Comayagua Valley, which is a big area for forestry and agriculture. And more specifically, the area that I spent most of my time in were in these areas, these communities, Siquatepique, Comayagua, and La Paz. And I got to travel in these areas, but mainly my home base was Siquatepique. My first impression of the area was that I had read a little bit about where I was going, Sequatapique is considered the garden city. And so I was expecting to see lush, but I could see how dry it was. We were in the dry season. I was there in April. But despite being dry, and I was there for 2 weeks, it rained once and very little. I don't know how these plants are able to survive the way they do, but they're just lush. Everything's still green. So it's not a desert area whatsoever. The other thing that I came to realize was that this area is a very historic area. There are so many colonial buildings that still exist. And Comayagua was actually the capital of Honduras, but no longer is, like the two other bigger cities are. And the other thing that I noticed historically was that culture, they had a really big culture. This area, especially Comayagua, was actually started off as a monastery. So the religion is still really, really pronounced in this area. A beautiful area. And we're in a valley, so we have the mountains, and you can have that lushness all the way from the mountains right down into the bottoms of the valleys. And they take advantage of this topography to grow various crops. So although I didn't have the lonely mountains in my view, we drove by these mountains all the time. So I felt like I was on a journey to Middle Earth. But before I go too far down the path of trying to show you all the nice things I saw, the real journey that I wanted to share with you today was the journey that I took from, as I mentioned before, the idea of doing some beekeeping development in a foreign country to actually getting involved, going on a trip, and coming back and basically doing what I'm doing right now, talking about it. So I'm going to try to take you through that whole entire journey. This might actually help you say, I would love to do that, or tell you, holy crap, I'm not interested in doing that right now. I got too many things on the go. Because I think the moral of this story is that it's very involving. Like there is a commitment here. This is not a vacation. If you do accept one of these assignments, you are working. Not from sun up to sundown. There's a lot of time off, like the weekends they give you time off. But it's a commitment. You're not going there and spending, a couple hours doing this and then have the rest of the day go sightseeing. That's not part of one of these tours. So I just wanted to put that up front. So I broke up my journey into 3 kind of separate parts. The before the trip, that's getting ready to go, and actually that includes kind of getting involved with the program while I was in Honduras, and then kind of the wrap up afterwards. So before I go too far into the journey, many of you might wonder, what is a Catalyst Plus? Like, what is that? Basically, Catalyst Plus is the kind of the new version of the KESO program. And some of you old-timers that have been coming to Red River APRIS meetings for a very long time might remember KESO. You've had many presentations from people like Charles Polsine that have given you kind of presentations on their various trips to different countries to do some beekeeping development. So Catalyst Plus is just the new version of KESO, which is basically an economic development organization, and it's there to provide mentorship and to foster leadership in these communities that are kind of depressed, like third world countries, so emerging countries, and indigenous populations as well too. So there is a version of Catalyst Plus that they focus on Canadian areas as well too, especially in the far north. So this program has been around for a very long time, but Catalyst Plus as the name, you might not be that familiar with because it's still fairly new. I think they only did it last year, right? Changed the name last year, so it's still relatively new. I will say that I'm going to use the word Catalyst Plus a few times in my presentation, but I'm not here to promote that program per se. I'm going to walk you through the steps that I went through to kind of get on this journey. But Catalyst Plus is kind of more the vehicle that I used for this journey. So I've put a picture of a pack mule, and there's times that I'm not sure who's the pack mule, whether it was them that were a pack mule because they helped me kind of move my stuff forward or carried me forward, or I was actually the pack mule that they were just using my labor to be able to run their program. So I think both of us at times were the pack mule in this. So in terms of phase one, what I call phase one, the before the trip, I'll just talk you through kind of how I got involved with Catalyst Plus. I'll go through a little bit about the application process and that vetting process. I'll also talk a little bit about how those assignments kind of come to you and whether, how you can choose them. And then if you choose one, how that whole approval process comes about. And then I'll talk a little bit about the actual travel and kind of how you develop that project and take it to the country and execute. So in terms of how I got involved with Catalyst Plus, even though I just mentioned there was a name change, I would say the seed that got planted, I think 20 years ago, was Charles Polstein talking about one of his assignments going to Armenia and the beekeeping development that he was doing out there. I thought that's a cool thing to do. That'll be cool when I get old. And 20 years later, I'm old and now I can do this kind of stuff. But at the time, I just thought that it was that's a great thing to do to spend in your retirement years. You build up all this experience and then you kind of retire, and do you keep on working, or do you actually start volunteering and just kind of giving this information, your time away? And I thought what he was doing was really inspiring. So I do think that Charles is, at least the impetus for me to kind of get involved. But I will say that the person that probably drove me to actually moving forward and actually going in and actually applying is here in the audience as well too, and it's Daryl Wright. We both got an email through our professional organization, CAPA, the Canadian Association of Professional Apiculturists, and Catalyst was actually kind of promoting its program via somebody that had a link to CAPA. So they talked about beekeeping development in this group, and I didn't apply right away. I said, that seems really interesting, and I think I actually got that email before I was officially retired, so I wasn't really ready to do anything yet. So I talked to Daryl about it, and then Daryl says, "Oh yeah, I'm signing up for it." So Daryl kind of just automatically got me thinking, if he's going to do it, I'll kind of see what he does, and I'll see if it's worthwhile. So if I'm going to go back to my Hobbit story, I would say that Daryl is my Gandalf. He's the kind of the guy that kind of brought me into the fold. So, and he kind of looks a little bit like Gandalf. If you put a big old hat on him, he's my Gandalf. So Charles was the first, but I think Daryl was the one that really got me to actually act on my impulses. So, with that said, this might sound a little bit dry, but I'm going to try to keep it lively enough as well too. When Daryl went through this process and actually went on an assignment, and again, he went to Ethiopia. So you've been to Ethiopia twice? Yeah. And he told me a little bit about it. I said, I've got to join. So I kind of went through that whole process. And I will say that even though I'm not promoting Catalyst Plus, it is a good program where they do their due diligence. Good or bad, they do their due diligence. And you're going to see why I'm saying good or bad. You have an application process. So if you have a certain skill set, you fill that out. You got to provide a resume, and you have to be a Canadian citizen to be part of this program. And you have to have you have to have health coverage in at least one of the provinces. So they need those as minimal requirements, but they're really going to look at your skill sets and your experiences to determine whether you're a good fit for this program. And after they review your application, it's a pretty simple process. The application was very doable. And then they get back to you relatively quick and say, you have some skills that we're interested. If you're interested in this, really interested in this, go through this orientation. And it's only a short video that you have to watch to kind of see what Catalyst Plus is about and stuff like that. It's not going to take a lot of time, so you could do it fairly quickly. And they cover off what kind of programs they're involved in. And they've got a lot of different programs, but they do have an agriculture kind of business program. And that's kind of where my skill sets lie. And then I've also heard that they have specific beekeeping ones as well, too. So I thought, it's worth the 15 minutes to watch this video. So they catch you with that 15-minute video, thinking this is really, really easy. And then they'll ask you, okay, we're going to do an interview. And the interview is pretty simple as well, too. They're just trying to get more of a background on you and see whether you're a good fit for them, because you are working in an area where many of these countries, they have a hierarchy. And if you're coming in as viewed as a high on the hierarchy, you can abuse your power very, very easy. So they're trying to see what kind of person you are. Are you going to abuse your power or not? So they kind of suss you out during that process. But it's still more kind of just getting your background, what kind of programs will best fit you. That wasn't very labor intensive either. Where they really catch you is once you get past that process, they ask you to take some training, some compliance training. And they have all these different modules. They have some on ethics, code of conduct. And it sounds like, that's probably a couple hours. I will tell you that I spent days taking these trainings. So it's a good way of sussing out who's committed and who's not. The nice thing about it, it's in a platform where you can start, taking some training. And if you run out of time, you could stop and you could go right back to where you were before. So thank God, because I started this thing. I have, 2 or 3 hours. I'm thinking I'm going to walk through most of the training. 2 or 3 hours gets me through one of the training sessions. Then the next day I go, do I have time today? Maybe tomorrow. So it takes you a while. If you've got other things going on, and I don't even have a job, it still took me days and days of short bursts of commitment to go through all that various training. So it is labor intensive. Then they ask you to do a criminal check. And if some of you may have had criminal checks to work with sports, or I know you had done one for Boy Scouts and stuff like that. Well, I guess I never volunteered enough because I'd never done a criminal report. I didn't have any reason to have a criminal report. So I thought it was going to be fairly straightforward. So you go and you apply for your criminal check and you submit it. And I will tell you, it's all after the fact, and it costs you about $75. It's not a big amount. I got lucky that I was able to get a letter from a different group that I was going to be volunteering with, so it didn't cost me anything. So if you've got other volunteer groups they can actually write you a letter and it doesn't cost you anything. But for me, I live outside of Winnipeg. I had to drive all the way to St. Pierre, Manitoba, to deliver my thing. Well, then you get there, you deliver it, they have to send it off to Ottawa. They send it off to Ottawa, and then it comes back and says, well, there's somebody with a similar name to yours. You're going to have to do fingerprinting. So then I got to go all the way back to St. Pierre, do some fingerprinting, and then they send it off again. So it's not instantaneous. I'm trying to drill home, this is not an instant process. So I finally passed a criminal check. And then you're actually at the point where they're now looking at specific projects for you and developing you have to sign a whole bunch of policy types things. And some of those are related to the countries that you're going to. And there's also a medical requirement. You have to go get a physical to tell you that you're capable of traveling. You have to make sure your visa, your passport is not going to expire in 6 months, because they will reject you based on that. So if your expiry date is within 6 months, you got to go get a new passport before you can go into this program. So there's a lot of hoops going through it, and I'm starting to scratch my head and kind of going, do I really want to do this? This is not, I haven't even started it. So you're kind of logging in all this time, but you kind of work your way through. Then they take $100 from you, which is, again, not a big deal, but that's kind of like you're really committed to the program, and now they're opening things up to you. So they do have this whole database portal system that you now have access to, that you can kind of look at various assignments. So it's all part of their process to kind of vet, people that are really committed to this. And I will say, again, I think it was a good process, but when I look back at how much time I actually spent, it was a big commitment. So, and it took quite a while. You're waiting for a lot of stuff. So then you're finally in the system where now, based on your background and stuff like that, they try to match various assignments that kind of fit in your genre. And I've had a few sent to me that I've kind of said, yeah, that's not my area of expertise, and I've kind of not selected those. And I've even passed on some beekeeping ones because, again, Daryl had done the Ethiopia thing, and I figured, I'm going to look at something different from what Daryl was doing as well, too. So, but I did get one fairly soon in my process, and I started my process in December, where I applied, and by that, by end of February, I had gone through their whole vetting process. And they had sent me this project for Honduras. And this particular project, the applicant was a cooperative. So they are the biggest co-op in Honduras. But their whole kind of proposal, their whole assignment was based on training women to have value added in their beekeeping. So I said, that sounds like a really good project that I can kind of get behind. So I submit you got to submit your proposal for their assignment. And I kind of talked about my background and all that stuff. And although I haven't done a lot of personal product development in my own beekeeping as a hobby, way back when we used to pack into small jars and like everybody else sell them, and then I got lazy and I kept on packing in bigger jars, and I kept on telling the customers, if you want to buy small containers, you can buy them from these people. I sell in a 3 kg container, and if you don't like that, I'm not your person, So I simplified our whole beekeeping enterprise, that we either bulk honey or 3 kgs. That was the smallest I went. So now I'm supposed to be talking about basically value-added production and all this other stuff. But I said, even though I don't have personal experience, I've organized, various trainings and stuff like that, but I know a lot of people. So I know somebody that does great value-added. I could pick their brain. So I say this all in my proposal, even though I'm not speaking from my own experience. I know a guy, So I get accepted. So they actually do accept me. And this is the cooperative that I was talking about. And this co-op, even though they work with smaller beekeepers, they also work with a lot of bigger beekeepers. And they do a lot for their beekeeping members. They are the honey buyer or packing plant. They are the bee equipment supply. They help train and do technical assistance to their beekeepers. So they're kind of a one-shop stop for their beekeeper members. So I'm still thinking that, this is going to be working with, and it was talking about the women in the countryside and the mountains and all this other stuff. And so I'm thinking, this will be great. This is exactly what I'm looking for. And as I start that process, we start going through, and they're saying, you're the applicant or the partner in Honduras would like to organize a virtual meeting with you to discuss this project. So I said, that's very, very reasonable. Well, we get into this meeting and they say, you seem to have a background in beekeeping diseases. Would you mind adding that to the assignment? So I said, that's right up my alley. So yeah, I'd be very much interested in that. Okay, we'll work on something like that. So I start working with the client, or in this case, Catalyst Plus calls them partners, working on this type of stuff, and we're developing a work plan. Well, this thing kind of ballooned into, I'm now giving workshops in various areas in Honduras. I'm training expert beekeepers, novice beekeepers, and I'm training their technical staff within the co-ops. Okay, this is way more than what the assignment said. And if you ever talk to another Catalyst Plus, whatever the proposal was in the beginning, That is the introduction to what you might end up doing. So I'm learning that they just keep on adding more stuff with that. I will say that in this program, all the travel arrangements and all that stuff was done for me. I didn't have to worry about it. So that's where I'll promote Catalyst Plus. It is a good program where they said they're going to do something and they just end up doing it. So they organized all of the travel arrangements. They do give you a little bit of walking around money, but part of the whole process is that the partner pays your accommodations and your meals and stuff like that. So, but we're in a country where everything's fairly reasonable. It's not costing them a lot either, but but they're going to want your pound of flesh. You are going to work when you're there. So I will still say that this whole process was definitely worthwhile. And even though all the work I did through the training sessions and all that stuff, which probably added now up to about a week, then comes, well, you're giving all these talks. And you're going to be leaving in 2 weeks on this assignment. You got to put together all those talks. And they need to be translated into Spanish. So now I'm working an 8-hour day for no pay. And I'm very, very, very lucky that even though I had the experience, in bee diseases, when I retired, I left all that stuff at the university and all that. I didn't take any of that stuff home. So now I got to go back to the university and the province begging, can I use some of the slides? I don't have time to prepare my own slides for presentations like that. So I guess a commitment of teaching the beekeeping course for 27 years does get you something where they said, yeah, you could use some of our material for that, the U of M beekeeping course. So I was able to put together the first 2 groups of slides or presentations fairly easy. And then they wanted me to talk about, well, we'd love to hear more about Manitoba beekeeping. Well, now I got to go back to Derek and beg for some slides to talk about Manitoba beekeeping as well, too. So that presentation came together fairly well as well, too. But now all that fancy talk at the beginning of my proposal that I know a guy that does value-added stuff, now I got to deliver on that stuff. So luckily I have a partner in crime, my Gandalf. We start talking about who should we kind of talk to about picking their brain to put into presentations here. So when we were looking at value added for honey products, we were going to talk about creamed honey, and we're going to talk about flavored honeys. If you talk about flavored honeys, who comes to mind here? Just anybody yell out a name. John Russell. So their lovely John Russell was willing to come on a Zoom call with us for probably about an hour and a half, and we just picked his brain, and then we had to take all that information and shove it into a presentation. Well, then they were also asking about wax, so we needed to kind of talk about, well, who does great candles and all that stuff? Well, I spent a little time drinking some whiskey at Tim's place before, and I said, Tim has some great products. So we convinced Tim to open up his garage to us and give us demonstrations on how he makes candles and all the tips and stuff like that so that we could take and put into presentations. But, all that's taking a little extra time. And then we talk about, well, one of the things they can really do with beeswax as well, too, if you talk to Tim, you need high quality wax. And then there's the ability to actually even produce higher quality of wax. So then we said, well, we should go see Ted Turnbull and kind of pick his brain about how do you actually process wax so that it's really high quality, that now this may be a quality that they don't have available to them right now, and that's a thing that they can market. So we drive all the way to Elgin, and we spend the whole damn day at Ted's place, videotaping him and all this other stuff. So I'm telling you, there's at least 10 days invested in getting ready to go on this trip. So when you add the previous time, the amount of time that I was actually on the trip, actually in Honduras, we spent at least that amount of time just getting ready to go on that trip. So again, you're going to invest a significant amount of time if you are going to take on something like this, especially with these types of challenges where we didn't have any prepared material. We had to produce a lot of this prepared material. And even the ones that I didn't have to produce, I still had to massage them, and we still had to kind of work through the process to get it to them so they could be translated. So I guess my moral to this story is that be prepared that if you commit, you may be committing to a lot. So just give it a lot of thought. Give yourself a lot of time before you have to deliver. I think my super challenge was that as I was going through the vetting process of actually becoming a Catalyst Plus advisor, I was already reviewing potential assignments, and I may have selected an assignment very, very early on, and maybe I should have gave myself a little bit more time, but it all worked out because I don't have a day job. So that is phase one, and now I'm about to leave to go to Honduras. And I'm going to break this part while I'm in country, while I'm on this trip, into the following type of categories. Kind of introductory orientation, implementation and adaptation, and reflection and inspiration. And these are all the kind of the trials and tribulations that I ran into, some just not knowing, some finding out that it doesn't work, so you have to kind of adapt to that and try to rejig everything. So there is a lot of that going on, and I think that goes on with all these types of development projects where if you're not that familiar with the infrastructure, just be prepared that things are not exactly like home. Your expectations are going to be dropped down to a third world country in many cases. So in terms of just starting back up with the introductions, like I had one video meeting with the people that I'm going to be spending the next 2 weeks with. So you don't have a lot of chance to really know them. So, those first couple of days when you finally arrive in the country, you're still trying to figure out where you fit into this whole process. So, I definitely feel like Bilbo when he got inundated with all those dwarves and kind of not knowing what their cultural, beliefs were and all that, and whether I was going to do some things that were going to be culturally inappropriate. And after all my training, that was heightened for me to make sure I don't do that. Many of you know me from all my other presentations, and I try not to swear in presentations, but I'm very, very vocal, and when I get excited, sometimes little colorful words come out, and I didn't know if that was going to happen there because I can't control them. I try to control them, but there's still something in me that they slip out. So I was really, really cognizant that I was a stranger in a strange land, and I kind of needed to spend the first couple of days just soaking everything in. So my cast of characters is as follows. The guy in the middle, he was the manager of this co-op, and he was basically the orchestrator. He was the leader of our group. He was the one that kind of drove all the stuff. So he was the one that wrote the original assignment. He was making all the decisions. So he was our leader. So if I'm going back to The Hobbit, he was Thorin Oakenshield. Like, he was our true leader. Everybody looked to him for guidance and, are we on the right path? So he played a really big role, but he was the manager. He had no beekeeping background. So when I had big beekeeping conversations with him, like beekeeping stuff, not honey marketing, it just went over his head. The people on this side, these were the technical people. She was actually the lead technical person, Flor, and she was from like a 4-generation beekeeping family. Like, beekeeping was absolutely in her blood. And Orlando was her number one. Like, she counted on Orlando a lot. And I realized that I was going to have to count on them quite a lot. The only thing is, neither of them spoke any English, and my Spanish is muy malo. Like, I thought I had a bit of a comprehension of Spanish, but when I got there and how fast they talked, and I didn't have the ear yet for it, we couldn't communicate. So we had to always go through, Thorin to be able to have some kind of conversation. But realizing that, and this guy's actually name is Carlos, Juan Carlos, he actually organized for me to have a translator while I was there. And this was just, a university student that was there on some kind of co-op program where she was a business student and she was spending some time on her little mini thesis, undergraduate thesis, at a business, and in this case it was a honey business, but she spoke really good English. So she was my translator, and her name was Adriana, and I wouldn't have been able to do what I needed to do without her, or at the very least, Carlos to be around there, because especially in the early days, it was so new to me that the Spanish was a Spanish that I wasn't quite used to. I'd spent some time in Chile, and when you spend enough time in a certain Spanish, you kind of get into the rhythm. This is a very, very different rhythm. So I was kind of lost at that point. But again, I've spent the first couple of days just trying to acclimatize myself to my new conditions. Luckily, you might be able to see this here too. This guy had asked me some very good questions right off the bat. He asked me, what was I into? And he says, do you like beer? And I said, I like beer. Do you like coffee? Oh, I like coffee. So he says, oh, we're going to get along really, really well. So he started organizing some stuff for us to kind of do, kind of just outside of working. So I arrived on a Friday night. Saturday morning, they took me to the co-op. I met a lot of people. I got introduced to the group. And we did a little bit of work, especially on the translation. There was a few slides that I needed to take a look at to make sure the translation was good. But then he says, you know what, we're going to spend the rest of the afternoon doing something totally different. We don't work here on weekends, so we'll do something fun. And he asked me, you know, do you like beaches, or do you like nature, or do you like, you know, historical stuff? And I said, well, if I had to pick which ones, I would say probably nature would be my first, and historical, and then I don't really have a beach bod, so beach would have been my last choice there. So he says, we got some caves that are nearby, so this is the prettiest pictures you're going to see from me, because I'm just not a photographer. So we went to these local caves, and it was pretty spectacular. They had some fancy lights in there, and you know, we spent that first day, but part of the whole acclimation that I was getting involved as well too is that I left basically at the beginning of April. We had just come out of winter. I still had my winter body on, a little extra fat, and you drop me into 32 degrees Celsius, and then you take me down into a cave that you think it would be cool down there. Hell no, it's 32 and 100% humidity. So I'm just melting, but I'm still appreciating, you know, that this is something that you don't get to see very often. So I did really like that trip. And I believe these ones were called angel wings. And I don't know if the picture does it quite right, but they did kind of look like angel wings. So it was a really nice thing to see. And I did take a few more pictures, but they all look the same. So then he takes me to this brewery, and then, like I said, I enjoy beer. So we're just kind of getting to know each other. We're in that real introduction phase. And one thing is that the fresh food, everything is just so fresh. All the fruit is just so fresh. Fresh seafood, everything just seems so fresh. And there's not very many times where I've eaten the entire fish. Bones were there, and it was absolutely delicious. And the beer wasn't bad either. And then, as kind of part of our orientation and our kind of just getting to know each other, basically at the end of, not every day, probably every second day, when we did the whole day's work, we'd go off to a coffee shop, get a nice coffee, and just kind of just talk. And a lot of times, everything we did that day, we might have spent 15 minutes talking about it, but we spent the next, half an hour, 3/4 of an hour talking about life. So he got to learn about my family, I got to learn about his family. So I would encourage anybody that if you go on these types of things, take the time to develop relationships. They're going to pay off in the end. The other orientation that I must say, there was a trepidation about working with African ISBs. And when I saw, and I don't know if this picture can really do it justice, when I saw the size of their smokers, this smoker is about this tall. And when they say they have a smoker, That's not only the device. That's a person that is assigned to the smoker, and all they do is they pump that smoker the entire time you're in a bee yard. So, a lot of times we complain and we go into the bee yard and you're trying to look at brood and the bees are covering, what you're trying to look at. In this case, you're going to see slides where the bees don't cover the stuff, but the smoke does. They got so much smoke going on, but it is an important part of beekeeping, and I was going to be exposed to Africanized bees for the first time in my career. The other orientation that I have to talk about was that I met all these people and they treated me so nicely. Like it pulled me in really, really, very quick. They got my jokes. Even when they were translated, they got my jokes. So anybody that can get my jokes, I'm a little bit like Donald Trump. If you kind of flirt with my little ego there, I'm going to like you a lot. So when they laughed at my jokes, that was just pulling me in. So they were really, really kind people. The other thing that you're probably going to notice, I think I gave myself the name first, but it kind of start to stick, was the big Canadian, because everywhere I went, I was usually the tallest guy there. And in this case, there were a lot of females that were part of the beekeeping industry in Honduras. So many of the females, they're this tall. Not all of them, but so I had the exact opposite of the Hobbit. If I would say I was Bilbo Baggins, I was the tallest Hobbit there ever was, because I just towered over everybody, except for this one group that I actually worked with, one of the last groups there, where this guy, he was actually taller than me. And it took 2 weeks before I finally ran into somebody. And I'm only 6'3". Like with shoes on, I'm 6'3". So I'm not 6'7", but I was definitely a giant in Honduras. This thing, I don't know if I'm ever going to get used to that, but if you went anywhere, and this was a lot of people's places, this was the plumbing system where the electrical was kind of on the outside of walls, and in this case, that's how you got hot water. And I don't know if you can really see that. All these electrics are definitely on the outside, so you're kind of wondering, am I going to get electrocuted while I'm taking a shower? And I will say that I had the prettiest chest hair, because all of these spouts came up to about my eyes, so I'm always ducking down trying to take a shower. So there was definitely some things that I was getting used to, and there was other things that I can't say that I got used to them. The next part was actually now doing what I was there to do, was actually start putting on some of the training sessions. And they had organized these training sessions, as I mentioned before. I had a training session one day of a workshop with experienced beekeepers. And then we would go out to the bee yard and do some, hive demonstrations stuff. And then after that would be a workshop with more novice, inexperienced beekeepers. And then a day in the field, and then I put on a workshop for technical staff. These people were involved with the various co-ops in the area that provided technical service to their members. So this was my experience group, and I will say that it worked out well, because this workshop was actually held in the co-op, and they had everything there. They had projectors that worked. They were in the city, Sequatapique, that had more or less consistent electricity. I'm foreboding that's not very consistent when you go outside the cities. And so I was in a boardroom that was much more comfortable to me. I was speaking to a group of beekeepers that I didn't have to, explain, all the jargon of beekeeping really to them. So I was given the task of, you have 5 hours to put on this workshop. Well, you give me 5 hours, sorry, Tim. I will use up the 5 hours, because I could just keep on talking and talking. So I basically put together presentations that covered every disease you can think about, and even ones that they weren't even worried about. But I tested all that on the experienced beekeepers. So this group, I will say, they were very interactive. So I would start talking and they would ask questions all the way through my talk. So I burnt through that time and I'm thinking, well, no, this is about the right amount of material. And they were kind of more or less keeping up with me, but that's a lot of talking. And I'm still talking through a translator. So they hear me and then they hear it again in a nice pretty voice. So they gave me a lot of feedback on my presentation where I asked them, I'm going to be talking to about a bunch of beekeepers that don't have a lot of experience. What should I really cut out of my presentation? Oh, no, it's all good. It's all good. So, I'm getting reinforced that I did an excellent job talking to these beekeepers, and my adrenaline was high and all this other stuff. So I thought I did a really good job. Then 2 days later, I give a talk in basically an open shed. There's construction going on, so I'm competing with a jackhammer. The electricity is coming on and off about every half an hour. So I would just get into the presentation and then woof, everything would shut down. So you have to learn to adapt. So I start cutting my presentation as I'm going, knowing that the audience, some of the presentation was much over their head. So I really wanted to get across Varroa and even start talking about Nosema, because they told me, the first group, as well as the co-op people, our biggest concerns right now are Africanized bees, and not necessarily the bad thing about the stinging of Africanized bees, the fact that you cannot keep them in the hives. They grow to a certain size, and then they swarm on you. So there's such an inconsistency in their production just based on losing half the workforce all the time. So they wanted to talk a little bit about that, and I said, I'm not your expert in that area. But then the other one was Varroa and Nosema, and I said, I have much more experience on that. So I'm going to really focus on those two areas. So I think I still had a very good discussion with the novice beekeepers, but it wasn't quite the same. I knew that I needed to kind of be more on the fly to actually deal with these. And unfortunately, when it's hot, because the other place had air conditioning. This one was just in an open. And when I say, 32 degrees, it is 32 degrees absolutely everywhere. In the shade, it's 32 degrees, and in the sun, it's probably more than that, but it's 32 degrees in most buildings. So everybody's hot. You got this guy droning on and off in two languages. I had some little old man fall asleep right in front of me, and I could have taken offense, but he was actually a bit of my canary, kind of saying, you're getting too deep. You need to start pulling back up and making it a little more lively. So I thanked him. I don't think he heard me thank him, but I was still learning as I was going. And then I got to my last group, which now these are technical type people. And when I say technical type people, they're given this title. They have a lot of beekeeping experience, but I learned later on, our definition of technical and their definition of technical are quite different. And I'll get into that when I talk about putting on a Nosema workshop. But that group, I got to admit, a slightly smaller group. I felt like I was talking to my own people. That's the group that I felt that I was having the most kind of impact with. But that was my whole idea. The whole idea is train the trainers. I'm going to be gone in 2 weeks. These people are going to be there. So if I'm going to spend my time training people, I'm going to give most of my energy to try to train these people properly so that when I go, that whole message can continue on. The other thing that adaptation and all this other stuff, well, this big Canadian, they took me to their warehouse where like I said, they're a bee supply as well as a packing plant. So they took me to their bee supply area and says, you need a bee suit. Well, they went rifling through all these bee suits, and they pull out the biggest bee suit. They give it to me, and I pull it on, and the crotch, if these bees were stinging, my shoulders were so tight that they would have just stung through that. So our adaptation was to put a second bee suit on top of me, and just the jacket part. Well, again, you got this little heavy-set, tall Canadian wearing 2 beekeeping suits at 32 degrees Celsius. Well, I was dying in there. And then I had brought a pair of boots, but my boots kind of went up to about here, like normal boots. Well, this thing was so tight, every time I bent down, well, the bottom of the suit would go up to there. Well, they said, that's not going to work. You're going to get your ankles still. So then I had to put on these sexy white boots. And then everybody wanted their picture with me, and I was so embarrassed with that whole outfit there. But
With your tan.
Stylish.
yeah, it's very stylish, yeah. I think they call it the Canadiense. That's the Canadian look now. But again, when I joke around that most people were way shorter than me, and if I would show you all the pictures, I just looked like this gigantic kind of, they must wonder if all Canadians looked like that. The other thing that I mentioned before, how I had to get used to, was that how much smoke that they use constantly. And when you're talking and you're breathing in this smoke, it's really difficult to talk, because I would have the person, they were trying to protect me from these bees. So they felt, especially the smoker guy, I don't know if he was told, don't let bees land on this guy. You got to smoke this guy all the time. We don't want him to be stung. We want him to be able to do the job. So here's a pumping. So I had this cloud of smoke around me all the time.
So, Rheal, what happens when you actually did smoke the Africanized bees? What did you actually?
Well, I will say this, and Daryl probably will contest to this, or whoever. The bees don't stay in the hive as soon as you open up a hive of Africanized bees. They start leaving the hive. So I don't even know if you really need smokers. Maybe the smoker is more for your protection. But you'll see, I think my next slide, is you pull out a frame. And this, to paint the picture, this is the time of the year where they've just pulled off honey. Back home, when you just pull off honey, your hives are about at their highest population ever. They're doing a lot of turnover of bee population as they're working hard for honey production. But now we're about almost 2 weeks after the main honey flow, and it's starting to calm down. So they're not working as hard as they were 2 weeks ago while they're in main honey flow. And still, every hive we open up, there's hardly any bees around. They seem to be there when you first crack the lid. And I was asking him, I said, can you crack the lid? And I would see the bees there, and all of a sudden they were all gone. And I said, is this normal? Oh, yeah, this is normal. I said, this population is normal? And then they would open up another one. They said, oh, this one's a little weaker. Well, it looks exactly the same as the other one, because the bees disappear so quickly. And, I'll get you a strong hive. They open up the strong hive, and there's like 5 extra bees in the strong hive. So there really was a big difference from what I was used to. And if you were a bee inspector needing to look at brood, boy, oh boy, you had no problems looking at brood, because if you pulled the frame out, the bees, if they stayed on the frame, they would just move to the sides, and you could actually see the comb so easily, or they flew off.
So they're not defensive?
I was told that at this time of the year, they're almost at their least defensive. I didn't get stung. And you know how it is when you're talking in a bee yard, they come at your face. I barely had them coming at my face. Might have been the guy behind me smoking a lot around me that I wasn't getting any bees coming around, but they were not aggressive at all. The only time that they actually showed that this wasn't normal, is when we've tried to leave the bee yard. We had parked the vehicles about, 200 meters, 250 meters away. So it was a decent walk to get there, down a hill. And as we walked down the hill leaving, the bees came right along with us. And then we kind of gathered down where the vehicles were, and we were going to have lunch down there. And probably for almost, 20 minutes, those bees stuck around us. Then they finally start to dissipate a bit. So it wasn't normal for bees to track you that closely and stay with you for that length of time. So I knew I was dealing with Africanized bees, but I did not get that, try to attack you at all costs. I remember showing up with that suit on, and, I don't normally wear gloves, but I wasn't going to take my gloves off. There were people there to watch me put on these workshops, which almost had the same level of equipment that we have here. So they weren't suiting up, to the nines. So I wonder, there must be some variability there as well, too. The one bee yard that we went to, that was Floor's yard. So she was trying to keep the Africanized bee genetics down to a minimum. So she was requeening with European stock as much as she possibly could to try to keep that aggression down. But when I visited another yard that they weren't doing that, I found the bees to be quite similar. They were nice days. There was a dry season, no rain or anything like that. I've been told sometimes Africanized bees are worse when it's sunny than when it's wet. But in this case, it was sunny and they were not aggressive whatsoever. The other problem there was that I was there to try to look for problems with the group. And one of the things was to kind of look for signs for, nosema, that we could take samples and then go back and check for nosema. So we were looking at some stronger hives, weaker hives, but then we were also going to sample for varroa. So we did some sampling for varroa, and the beekeepers there are not much different than here. They knew how to sample for varroa. They had seen it before. They've watched videos, but then you ask them, do you sample for varroa? Not very often. We have our honey flow kind of is there for 3 weeks to a month, and then it goes away for about 2 weeks. I take that time to deal with the varroa. So they were kind of using more the opportunity to try to get on top of varroa. And usually, if they were doing something, they were trying to use a caricide to bring the varroa down. The unfortunate thing is that, again, beekeeping is I wouldn't say it's a subsistence living there, but it's not a real, it's not a highly priced industry. So spending a lot of money on acaricides just seemed like it was throwing money away. So they wouldn't go into a lot of details, but I think there was a lot of homemade remedies that they were always trying to use to keep the varroa down. I will show you that we took samples. Again, this is the time of the year where they're just coming off the honey flow. So the population had been going for a while, and they hadn't treated these hives for a while. And we did the perfect, shake and all that stuff. And we weren't finding astronomical numbers of varroa mites. So the hives weren't suffering tremendously because of varroa mite. But I said, is this a normal amount of varroa mite, especially to the technical people? Oh, I said, oh yeah, our expectation, our beekeepers kind of get a little antsy when you start going over 1%, and 5 to 10% is just totally acceptable. When you start going over 10%, then you might be starting to have a bit of a problem. So how they kind of look at the problem of varroa is still quite different. That might be some of the reasons why they're having some of these problems with their inconsistency in population, because there might have been some. So we did test some strong colonies and some weak colonies, but we were still finding similar levels of varroa mite. But I also knew that this is a bit of a bias. They take me to the best beekeeper, and they're showing me their best hives to do a demonstration like this. They should have taken me to say, we've been dealing with this one beekeeper. He seems to have the most problems. Let's go see some of that. But I understand, and I'll talk a little bit about how developing relationships and getting down to the nitty-gritty with people that you don't really know very well, and try to break that barrier where now you both are not trying to show your best hand all the time. I think that's where, if you ever have a phase 3 or 4 or phase 4 of a project, I think that's where you can start. You just jump all this introduction stuff and you get into show me your worst. Then you can have those conversations. But everybody doesn't know each other quite enough to feel that they want to show their vulnerability. Yes?
How long are they dealing with varroa already?
They've been dealing with it for quite a while. Probably almost as long as we have. So at least 20 plus years. They seem to know all the bad things about varroa, like when you have a big varroa problem, these are all the other things that tend to happen. So they were familiar with, viruses and all this other stuff. They don't tend to they don't worry about that stuff. They tend to worry about the immediate stuff. What do I need to do to bring my varroa down? They actually may be a little bit farther than some of us sometimes, where they already come to the realization that 0 is not what you're actually targeting. You're just trying to get it down to a point where everything's still working well enough. They don't need the max. They just need something that is enough consistency that they know that based on that level of general health of my hives, I'm making enough money to pay the bills. I think what we can do in these types of programs is try to kind of keep on pushing that expectation a little bit more so that they accept kind of, no, I need to do better than what I'm doing right now just to have a little bit more money. And there's always a tipping point. You know, we always talk about that, you know, if you split a hive, you can split a hive in half, and then you think that you've got 2 hives that are producing you a lot of honey, and they each produce about 100 pounds each. No, they each produce about 50 pounds each, just to make the math a lot easier. And you're pretty happy. Well, you know, 50 pounds each, that's not too bad. But if you actually would have kept that hive together, taking maybe a small nuke off of it, but kept the colony stronger, that hive might make 150 to 200 pounds, just that parent hive, and then you might still get 30 pounds or 25 pounds from the other one. Well, when you add them all together, but no, they get stuck with the numbers as well, just like a lot of us as well too. 2 hives. But if you're going to lose one, if you all have all your money in that one big parent hive and you lose it, then you're in trouble as well too. So they're always minimizing their losses. They don't maximize their gains, they minimize their losses. So, and I don't know their system well enough to know that that's not the best you can expect, you know. And I don't claim to. I need to experience more to understand whether if I encourage them to do it a different way, whether that would actually be beneficial. I need to understand that system a little bit more and what's at risk. So Varroa is very common for them. And the 2 products that they have listed available are fluvalinate and flumethrin. Well, they're almost the same product, so they don't really have 2 products out there. So, but then there's a lot of internet concoctions that they tend to do. And I could tell the big commercial beekeepers, I should watch what I'm doing here. The big commercial beekeepers, boy, oh boy, I think a lot of them had degrees in chemistry because they seemed to be talking amongst each other when I asked about what chemicals, and they didn't know if they should share or not. So then this is just an example of adaptation. So with my technical group, we talked a little bit more about like taking pool samples because you're doing it in other people's hives. You want to do it quickly and all that stuff. So I explained to the technical people in my broken Spanish what I was looking for to do a bigger sample than those commercial handshakers. Kind of like what you've seen, you know, like the university uses where you have a basket and you just wash maybe like 500 bees or even 600 bees at a time. So I'm telling them I need this kind of sieve and all this other stuff. Well, this is what their workshop came up with. And I told them I'm going to do that in a 5-gallon pail and all that stuff. Well, something definitely got lost in translation. It was beautiful. Like it was strung super tight. You could play tennis with that thing. But it just wouldn't fit. So I just realized that was my bad instruction. You know, I just didn't spend enough time. But we were on our way to the bee yard. And so we go to a bee yard and we're driving down the hill because all these bee yards are in the mountains. I'm surprised I didn't learn how to yodel because every time it always seemed like we were going uphill. But we were coming downhill into this bee yard, and as we're driving in, and I'm still thinking, I don't know, we can't do this pooled sample because this thing's not going to fit in a bucket. Just the corner of my eye, I could see a bit of a pile of garbage, and I could see some hardware cloth. And I went, I got to go check out that pile. So we finally arrived where we are. Then they could see this big Canadian just walking back up the hill, and where in the hell is he going? So I go to this garbage pile, and sure enough, there's hardware cloth. So I grab a couple pieces, I come down the hill, and I start explaining kind of what the basket I needed to be circular to fit into this pail. So then I'm starting to kind of pull it together. Well, no. My Orlando guy, he just takes it and he goes off, and so I don't know how they're going to stitch all these things together. Well, he comes back out. He's got elastic bands put around this stuff. So the ingenuity there, I guess out of necessity, you find ingenuity. Well, they do that all the time. Well, he strung this basket up in about 2.2 seconds. So then I was able to show them a pooled sample. I said, you know, this is ugly as hell, but it still will work. You know, but this is the concept you want to have in these big pooled samples. So it was just adapting just to what you're going to be dealing with. Everything that you just take for granted, a lot of times is just not going to be available to you. And it worked very, very well. We took our samples of bees, we brought it back to be analyzed. And in the meantime, I had been talking to Juan Carlos, Thorn and Oakenshield, and I told him that if we're going to put on this workshop, we need to have microscopes. Oh, we have microscopes. So then he finally shows me the microscopes. And he shows me the first microscope. You have 2 microscopes. Here's the first microscope. Well, that's a dissecting microscope. That's not a compound microscope. You can't see Nosema spores with this microscope. Oh, I'll get the other microscope. So you always say, it's another compound microscope. So we have no compound microscope, and the workshop's going to be in a couple of days. So I said, well, compound microscopes are not going to be readily available, and for you to try to purchase them at this late date, you're probably not going to be able to find them. You have some local university or even a high school would probably have a compound microscope. If you contacted one of them, and borrowed it or even offered to rent it, we just need it for this, a short workshop. We had a plan that the Nosema workshop will be a half-a-day workshop. I thought that's all we're going to need because as technical people, we're going to be able to nail this thing out really, really quickly. Well, this is where this character comes in. This is my elf that joined our group. This is the dean at the local university. It's actually a forestry university, but Juan Carlos had put the call out to find a microscope, and he's an entomologist, and he got back to Juan Carlos and says, well, we have some microscopes. Why don't you come and see what we have, and you can see we might be able to lend it to you. So we go over, he drags me over with him and stuff like that. I want you to pick the microscope because I don't know anything about microscope. I'm a business guy. So we visit with Juan Carlos, and he is an entomologist. I'm an entomologist. Blah, blah, blah. We start talking entomology. Well, we're in with this guy. He's going, better than lending you the microscope, why don't you hold the workshop here? So now we have a venue, and we have multiple microscopes to work with. So that worked out really, really well. But then we need a hemocytometer. I don't know if everybody's familiar with that. That's how you count the number of spores. Well, we don't have a hemocytometer. And I said, well, they're readily available on Amazon. Yeah. In Honduras, you order something on Amazon, you're lucky if it comes in 2 weeks. I said, it comes in a day in Canada. So I'm projecting what I'm used to and needing to adapt to that. Well, he says, okay, I got a friend in Miami. If I got my friend in Miami to order on Amazon and he FedExes it, we get FedEx in 1 day. So that's what they had to do. They had to order on Amazon, FedEx it, and we got it just in time, actually the morning that we were going to be doing the workshop. So then we're prepared to do this workshop, and I'm going to try to keep this a little bit quicker. I have till 9:30 or 9:15?
Yeah,
Okay, so that gives me, I'll do it by 9:30, but 9:15 is not going to happen unless I jump. So we're prepared to do this thing. And again, I'm still thinking that these are technical people. I spent the days with them. They seemed very knowledgeable about bees and beekeeping and stuff like that. Well, we get there, when you start talking about microscopes, not a single one of them had ever used a microscope. Well, now you got your whole plan, your training plan is now how to use a microscope before you can even start looking at Nosema. So luckily, the professor was very familiar with, so there was 2 of us that can break up into small groups and show them how to use these microscopes. So I still will say that they learn incredibly fast. So we spent the time, learning how to properly use the microscope, how to use this hemocytometer, and then actually looking for spores. The unfortunate thing is that it was just after the honey flow. All the samples, strong colonies, weak colonies, we looked for Nosema spores. We were able to find some spores, but they were in very, very low numbers. So it wasn't the time of the year to actually really look, so they couldn't practice very much. We found one sample that had it, and everybody comes to the microscope to take a look at it. And then he had an ability to take pictures of the actual slides as well, too. But the biggest thing is that we were very short in time, but I said, if I do everything, you're not going to learn. So I said, we need to spend the time having these people actually do this as well too, because repetition, practice is all they're going to need to do that. And they're going to need to do homework later on. So one of my take-home messages was that if these co-ops are going to offer this service, you got to train your technical people to do that. And you need to buy them a microscope, and they have to practice before they actually be able to offer this service. So they were really eager. So it was really, really worthwhile. So the last project I'm going to quickly talk about is the creamed honey and the flavored honeys. And again, I have to owe a lot of thanks to John Russell for spending the time with us. And even more than that, John Russell gave us a sample of his creamed honey. So the seed honey used to cream this Honduras honey came from John Russell. So we took them through the entire process, and you got to realize that their honey is always high in moisture. You can't get the moisture down to like 17.8. A lot of times they just have to accept, 20% moisture, and sometimes higher than that. And they do have honey that granulates. Some honeys that don't granulate very much. So we needed to make sure we picked a honey that was probably going to meet the requirements for creaming the best. Something that did have a little bit of granulation processing in it, but also was their lowest moisture. So it was produced at a time when it was low moisture. So we found this one type of honey, and this honey tasted really, really nice. I think the plant was Tatascan, and I know it's a shrub or something like that, but it was a really nice flavored honey. So we were testing all these different honeys to cream, and I said, this one's nice. And I said, even though it's dark, I says, when we do this process, you're going to see it lighten up a whole bunch. So they don't get a lot of light honey. So they were actually interested just in the lightness that they can get in this honey too. But because it was high moisture and it had been sitting for a while, we did the full dice method. So we actually heated, and it was granulated. So we had to heat up the honey to be able to do this whole process. So I did the instruction on it, and then we did the real practical stuff. And we had to heat it up. And again, we're in a damn building. In the warehouse, and it's 30 degrees in there. So we're trying to do all this stuff at 30 degrees. So we heat up the honey to about 65 degrees Celsius. We had to bring it all the way up there and try to kill off any yeasts as much as possible so that it wouldn't have a problem later on, and it would produce a little fine creamed honey as well too. Then we had to use an ice bath to cool everything down so that we can start the creaming process. So we cooled it down, and they had access to a big mixer. That was really good. We added John seed, and we started going through the process where you mix for like 15 minutes, and then you let it sit, and we'd go do something else. And then we'd come back, and we'd, 3/4 of an hour later, and we'd mix it again. And I think we mixed it about 3 or 4 times. And then we needed to store it overnight to see how well that set was. And then if it was still a little bit coarse, or if there was still some kind of liquid honeys in there, we said we would mix it one more time. And we needed to mix it anyways to be able to pour it again. So I said, we're going to mix it at least one more time. So we cooled it down. We got it down to, I don't think you could see there, it was about 25 degrees Celsius in that cool ice bath. And then we were looking for a place to store this thing overnight. And you want to store it, somewhere that's cooler than 32 degrees. And even at night, it might go down to 26 degrees, So we found that Juan Carlos' office, he had an air conditioner in there, so we set it down to as low as it could go, and it went down to 20 degrees Celsius. So we stored the honey in his office for overnight. Then we mixed it up the next day, and then we start pouring it. And I'll tell you, the faces of these people watched this process. They had tried creaming honey before, but they just jumped the gun. There's a process that, if you follow this process, you're going to get a finer creamed honey, and it's going to set, and it's going to stay set. And they kind of were humming and hawing whether that was going to be possible. And I just watched their faces as we went further in the process and saying, I've never seen honey like this. And that's our honey? And I said, yeah, it's 90% Honduras and 10% John Russell, So it's mostly your honey. And we were going to produce seed honey from this, that later on, John Russell is not going to be 10%, it's going to be 1%, So sooner than later, they were going to get rid of all the Canadian and they were just going to be Honduras honey. So they found that really, really worthwhile. And we tried some of the flavorings. We tried, and again, you talk about, they didn't use, high quality extracts or anything like that, whatever they could find in the grocery store. But the one that worked out in terms of flavor the best was a coffee one. And they just went and grabbed some instant coffee, but it was a high-end instant coffee. And the flavor was just unbelievable. So we were able to make some, and they now needed a place that they needed to store it, for that 3 to 5 days, at that ideal temperature for creaming or granulation, which is about 14 degrees Celsius. Well, we looked all the way through the plant to find anything, and I told them, we might be able to contact a grocery store or even some fruit warehouses. They might have to store fruit at lower temperatures. What fruits get stored at what temperature? So I start looking all this stuff up, and avocados and all that, the ideal temperature to store an avocado is 14 degrees Celsius. So I said, we can do that. But he said, let's check. We have all these guys that are machinists and all this working in their warehouse. Let's go talk to somebody there. So one guy says, oh yeah, let me go check the fridge. He starts rewiring the fridge, and he was able to rewire the fridge that he basically got it. And I think it's 15.3 degrees Celsius. I said, that's close enough. Compared to 32, that we're there. So I'm leaving now, so I said, I'm not going to be able to see the end of this process, but I want you to send pictures when it's finally done. So, I thought I put pictures. They sent me pictures after, and it was like the nicest creamed honey that we could produce out here. And they had to recondition. You keep it at that 14 or 15 degrees Celsius for that 3 to 5 days or up to a week even. And then you pull it out, and then you've got to condition it for about 3 days at room temperature. Well, a little bit more than room temperature, at 30 degrees, just to kind of make sure that set's going to stay at 30 degrees. So I told them, give me a picture when it first comes out, and give me a picture after 3 days. And even after 3 days, sitting out there, it was set perfectly solid. It was the pure honey was actually a firm set, but you could see it was like butter. And the flavored honeys, they were all a softer set. So they didn't, so I don't know how coarse those would have been, but the seed honey that they produced was super fine. So John, your creamed honey worked exceptionally well. So that was that process. So now I'm at the last part of while I'm still there. And as we're going through all this, I'm talking about trying to build up relationships, and there's a bit of a language barrier, even though my translator really helped bridge all those gaps. I was telling them, before I leave, let's have a meeting to talk about the whole process, and I want your feedback, and I'll share you my feedback as well, too, as what I thought that worked and what didn't work. And now that I'm spending enough time with you guys, you can't hurt my feelings. If there's something I did that wasn't right, tell me now, because I will try to modify what I do, and I'm going to try to do the same for you as well, too. So we went through this whole process, but I was told that they had never done that before. And if they did, it was all this hierarchical stuff. They have had catalyst advisors before, and I'm not trying to shit on them, but they just dealt with Juan Carlos. They treated the technical staff as just kind of employees and stuff like that. Well, I knew the technical staff were the most important part of my project. So I wanted their feedback, and they said, we've never been invited to a meeting like that. So I said, I'm going to put this down as a recommendation for future ones as well, too. And because Flor is the lead, but she's a woman, and their hierarchical system, women are always a little bit lower, that every time we had a workshop, she had to leave the workshop to put in the food order to come back, even though she's the most valuable technical person to train. Well, she felt now comfortable enough to say that, I missed a lot of your workshops because I was out doing all this stuff. I said, that's not acceptable. So then when we had the meeting, Juan Carlos is there, and I'm looking at Juan Carlos and saying, you need to fix this. And they have a system where he knows that. He lectures at the university as well, too. He has a full-time job, and he's a lecturer at the university. So he's training the next generation. He sees, female empowerment firsthand. And so he's going, I try to do a lot of this stuff in the co-op where if I see somebody with talents, I raise them up. And I saw Flora's beekeeping background being such an asset that we raised her up. But our system still tells her that if you're organizing something like that, the women go do this, the women. So even he kind of said, I was blind to that. I didn't even know that. So these things, these type of wrap-up sessions are so valuable. So we worked through a lot of that. And I did find out that when you give me 5 hours to talk, I shouldn't talk for 5 hours, because that first group that says, oh, keep it all in there, she says, they were tired. They were talking about how tired they were. They looked enthusiastic and they asked a lot of questions. But he says, they were also very tired. And I says, well, normally we would break these things up a little bit more, but I didn't felt comfortable enough. You tell me to talk for 5 hours. I should have said, I've taught the beekeeping course. Who here has taken a beekeeping course and listened to the disease lectures 2 in a row? And especially if you're a novice beekeeper, about an hour in, it starts going over your head and you're not even listening. And then if you've got an hour and a half of a lecture, there's at least half an hour a lecture you're not even there. Well, imagine applying translation to that as well too. So we said, okay, we broke up our field day separate from our lecture day. We used the 2 days, but it's a morning lecture, afternoon field, morning lecture, afternoon field, if we need another afternoon field. So there was a lot of learning, and I was getting their feedback on that as well too. I also found out that I need to improve my Spanish, and I need to be able to communicate a lot better. My understanding was good, especially after my own talks. My translator would say something and that's not what I said, so I would be able to catch her a little bit, but it still wasn't enough for me to really have good conversation. So if you ever go on something like this and it's a different language, try the effort to kind of learn as much as you can that language. It just will improve it. So I know that if I'm going to continue to do Spanish-speaking countries, that's another area I need to invest in. And lastly, I talked about that very early on, the relationships that you build. Try to build it with all the people that are part of that, not just the higher-ups. And because the best feedback I got were from those people that never were ever asked about their opinion on all this stuff. They were the ones that were actually helping me provide my recommendations. Because if I would have just counted on the business guy, he wouldn't have been able to do it. He's great at honey marketing and all that stuff, but this whole thing was about how to improve beekeeping. And he's passionate about beekeeping in the sense of honey production, but he's not passionate about beekeeping whatsoever. So that was one thing that I took home. That was not only a reflection. I know that if I ever accept one of these things again, I'm going to make sure that's part of the grassroots. In fact, we should have had these little wrap-up sessions after every big activity to find out if that activity was on the right track, and if it wasn't, change it up so that you can address the next group with a different one. Like if I would have really known that their technical people didn't have any, experience with microscopes, that should have been a whole day lecture. And if I would have known that beforehand, I would have actually probably brought or shipped some samples of Nosema beforehand, so that we would have had something to work with, and that's a bit of a follow-up. So I'm down to my last couple of slides. We're now exiting phase 2, and now we're into phase 3. So what you have in phase 3 is that you have a final report. And I have to admit that because this is my first assignment, I didn't know what to expect with a final report. So Juan Carlos says, I got a couple. We have done a couple Catalyst Plus assignments. I'll give you, the final report from those assignments. Well, they were like, I think one was on 1 page, front and back, so maybe 2 pages if you count each side of the page. And I'm looking at what they were saying, and there was nothing to these final reports. So I said, I think I learned a lot on there. I'm going to spill my guts. So I don't know if the people that read final reports appreciated my 8-page final report, but I felt I needed to do that. So if I was to tell anybody, that's probably one of the most important parts of this, because it helps set up the next person to what is the ground level you want to start setting up. Because I felt like I was stepping in the footsteps of other people that stepped there before, but I'm stepping in the exact footsteps. I shouldn't have to step there anymore. I should be able to go where they stopped. I should be able to continue on. So I think that was really, really important. And report the good and bad. Don't sugarcoat it. And I learned that from the wrap-up session, that we were laughing at the end about kind of like, you know me, I get a little passionate about something. Something wasn't working. I would get a little animated, and sometimes the F-bomb would kind of come out saying, that didn't work, and stuff like that. So then they kind of, because the one project I didn't do is that they wanted to do, and we spent time with Tim to learn about beeswax. Well, we were supposed to do some training of beeswax, and it was supposed to be these women from the mountains. Well, I came there the next day expecting to see new people. Everybody at that workshop worked at the co-op. I says, where's the mountain women? So I'm going, it's false advertisement, so I'm trying to work with that. And then they're telling me what's going to be available. And I'd seen their molds, and I said, well, there's barely any molds to kind of show you all the different techniques. We had this complicated slide where we're hand dipping candles, we're doing all this kind of stuff, and you've got these Chinese cheap-ass molds that, I said, I wouldn't recommend these. So I said, we're going to do hand dips and stuff like that. So I got them to make a hand dipper and stuff like that. But we were going to do everything with propane gas inside their packing plant. I said, you guys are nuts. If we have an explosion, you're going to lose your packing plant. Right at the end of honey production, and you're beginning your packing season. Oh, we'll do it outside. I don't think... So I told them, you guys are not ready for that assignment. I said, I have no problem, not doing it. I will make the argument why we couldn't do it, so we're just going to... I'll put that in my final report. So I very nicely said, that there was a safety concern and stuff like that, and they need to do some more investment before we carried it on. But it was a worthwhile project. I should have said a little bit more that I wanted my mountain women to be down there, not just government or plant employees. But so good and bad, you have to kind of bring it up. And when you talk about even sometimes on the bad thing, you got to make it inspirational. So everything that I kind of I kicked at it a little bit. I still did it. Try to do it in a way that if this didn't work, there's ways around that. So you try to bring it back on the positive side. When I came back, I talked to the university, and I actually got some samples off of Matthew to actually send them some high varroa samples in aqueous solution, so that I sent it to the university so that they have now training samples that they're going to be able to find nosema in those samples very, very easily. You said they were loaded, right?
Oh yeah, you just accidentally used the word varroa, so I just wanted to...
Oh, nosema. So, yeah, nosema samples. And then one of the things I wanted to do for them as well too is that when I kept on talking about, and I showed them, I gave a presentation on Manitoba beekeeping, but they still couldn't have an index. I said, well, it's April. My hives are just coming out of winter. Why don't I show you a little bit of chronology of the development of a Manitoba hive? So I took a picture or video, shortly after coming out, and I picked one hive, and I said, we're going to follow this hive through the season. I only did it 3 times, but we did it right at the very beginning of the season. So they kind of see the strength of the hive at the beginning of the season, and then we kind of did it in that basically mid-spring management period, and then we did it right before the honey flow. And in fact, I took still photos of the hive with all of its honey boxes on, and I think they were answering back, Photoshop, So they almost couldn't believe that hive. So that was, I think, that was well worthwhile. And I think investing in those relationships and keeping those open lines of communications is so important. You spend enough time preparing to go on these trips and enough time on these trips that you've invested. Why not keep that investment going? So I consider some of these people my friend. The translator actually contacted me about 3 weeks ago. She asked me for a reference letter because she's going to grad school in Miami. So, yeah. The last thing I would say is that because it's a big commitment, and again, I hope I'm not overselling that, it's worthwhile, but pick something you're passionate about, because it's a big commitment. If you're not passionate about it, one, you're going to be spending a lot of time. You might get bitter about it to try to get all these things together. But the other one is that if you don't have the passion, it's going to show in your delivery as well too. So I've turned down ones because I don't think I could be passionate about them. I'm going to pick the ones that I feel passionate about. I like mountain women. I want to have an impact. I want to have an impact, and because that's the part of this whole selling. They want to bring up, these subsistence incomes up, and a lot of them are delivered to women entrepreneurs. And that's what I was sold. And I thought, this is how you have the biggest impact on a family. So when I got, women, so I'm still checking off a lot of boxes, but I really wanted to help those ones that were even these small little changes in management or small little changes in how they manage their final product just allows them to sell that thing in a different location or have a different thing to offer to the market, would have a big impact on them. That's what I'm looking for, big bang for buck, and I thought that demographic was exactly what I was looking for. So I think that is my last slide. This is this is where I spent my evening before I actually jumped on a plane.
That wisteria?
Eh?
Is that all wisteria maybe?
I don't even know what it was, but it smelled absolutely delicious. No, they're kind of all yellowy, and the petal drop, like you were sitting there with a beer, and you'd have these things falling into your glass, and I just thought it was part of the ambiance, so I left them in there. And I will still say that I came back richer for it, and I'm not trying to, push myself, but I didn't go there to make money. So my last dollars that I had there, I spent it on the people so I took everybody out for lunch. And then on my way to the airport, I kept enough to buy a meal at the airport, but we were walking to the vehicle after we had gone for beers. And this person was begging on the side of the street with her child. I just opened my wallet. What am I to do with Honduras, money there, Limpra? And I just gave it to my whole wad, and I just took off. So that made me feel good. So that's part of giving. If you're volunteering your time, might as well just give it all. I didn't go there for a paycheck whatsoever.